The fact that we're even having discourse about this is exactly the point. The point isn't the dog whistle part. The point is the discourse about whether or not it is a dog whistle. From the Diving Board is a show hosted by me, charlichats, dedicated to decoding digital culture by unpacking the hidden politics behind the screen. Imagine trying to explain rage bait to a child in the Victorian era. Where would you start, and how would you go about explaining each Jojo Siwa rebrand iteration? In 2025, it feels like rage bait has become the MO for anyone hoping to make a name for themselves, from politicians to pop stars. But where does the idea of personal branding even come from? And if your personal brand is rage bait, what does this say about the state of our values right now? Hey guys, welcome back to another channel episode. I'm very excited. This has been an episode that I've been hoping to make for a very long time, and I just didn't feel like I had the knowledge base to do so until I started reading Doppelganger by Naomi Klein, and I genuinely feel like that book is changing my life. I'm not finished. I'm like a third of the way in. This might be the best book I've read in 2025 so far. I also want to give a massive thank you to everyone who has shown me so much support over the last few months. A little plug that if you haven't already, please rate this podcast 5 stars if you're listening to it on any podcast platform, because it seriously helps so much just to allow other people to find the content, and it helps me to then create more content if other people can find it. So win-win situation for everyone involved. I think it's time we get on in. The idea of the personal brand is kind of, in my opinion, the late stage capitalist final boss. A personal brand suggests that you've chosen to highlight certain qualities about yourself, package them up, tie a bow around it, and sell it off to the rest of the world. Whether it be packaging up certain qualities that you think will align with a company that you want to work for, or whether or not you're a celebrity and you're trying to portray a certain image about yourself to earn certain brand deals, or the same goes for influencer culture. We are living in a time where branding is everything. Or at least we're told that's the case. Usually, and at least in the past, personal brands have been fairly consistent, and that's been successful for a period of time. It seems that the only marketing technique that is working at the moment is completely tossing any formula to the side and shocking the system, using forms like rage bait and complete brand disconnectedness by changing your image up every 2 seconds to earn some kind of shock value, which actually does seem to be working. Recent ad campaigns like American Eagle and Sydney Sweeney's jeans campaign, or looking at literal individual people like Jojo Siwa, demonstrate that perhaps gaining public attention outweighs any desire to stick to morality at the moment. So in this episode, I want to unpack how we got here, the neoliberal origins of the personal brand, and where we go from here. I often grapple with this idea that who I am online isn't actually who I am in real life, and it doesn't matter how hard I try to portray a quote unquote like authentic version of myself, it is literally impossible to do so. As soon as you're trying to portray yourself in a particular light online, even if that is a light that you perceive to be authentic, it can't be authentic. The idea of authenticity online is a hyperbole, because there's always going to be some level of intentionality behind what you're choosing to share. Because of the tools that we have on social media, it's always going to be curated to an extent. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. Like, don't mind me. I love an Instagram dump. I love a curated post, actually. Like, I love when someone has clearly edited their post to a T. They've got some kind of collage going on. They've got like, I've been loving the Instagram layout feature recently, where you've got like 2 photos on top of each other. Oh, when the photos, like the colors align in in 2 different photos. And I did attempt to do that recently on an Instagram post, and I was pretty proud of myself, which is kind of embarrassing to admit. There's a level of, I think also in this era where everyone's trying to be nonchalant, it is a bit cringe to like admit that there is a level of curation going on. But again, I have to say, like, I'm sorry, there is no such thing as being nonchalant, and that is a hill I will die on. But I think what's really interesting is that until apps like TikTok came around that basically democratized virality reality, a lot of us were really only sharing parts of our lives for our friends and family. In the 2020 era of TikTok, when it became quite apparent that you actually could go viral and that anyone could go viral, with the likes of Charli D'Amelio and Addison Rae dancing in their bedrooms and like literally generating that virality into significant financial gain and fame, suddenly the game completely changed. If you had a public profile, you could potentially be the next star. And so what I think is funny about this is that we were no longer tailoring our content to our friends and family and providing that content in a way that might send a certain message to our friends and family. We had to tailor our content to the world at large, because that's how TikTok works. Your goal wasn't really for your friends, it was to go viral. We suddenly had to give anyone in the world at large an insight into who we were who didn't know us. And this required some level of personal branding and marketing. When you have to portray yourself in a way that's almost like a brand, it's very hard to do that in a way that's actually unique. And so we end up seeing kind of the healthy lifestyle influencers, clean girl influencers, homemaking content, fast fashion content, slow fashion content. And oftentimes people in these niches have a very similar vibe to them. I think because you're trying to identify that you're part of this tribe and that you want these types of people to watch your content, there is a level of kind of mimicking that happens to make sure that the algorithm understands that you want to be on this side of TikTok, which leads to an almost flattening of individuality because everyone's content feels slightly similar. Except the thing is, as social media has become more and more and more saturated, people are getting bored of this almost formulaic style of content. And it doesn't seem to be as easy to succeed in the industry as it was maybe in 2020. If so many people are able to enter this industry and to gain virality and traction and gain a following, it becomes harder and harder to enter just because, as I said before, attention is finite. When so many formulas have been tried and tested, you almost have to kick the formulas to the curb and do something completely radical. And here is where I want to talk about the rule-breaking anarchy on TikTok that we've entered into at the moment. To succeed in this era, you have to offer something that is very unique and distinct. And often to do that, you have to play on people's emotions. You have to create some level of shock that lets people stick around or encourages people to stick around. Personal brands start to become far less like the people who have them and more curated to this almost constant disconnectedness. Enter people like Jojo Siwa, whose personal brand seems to be the rebrand. But before we talk about Jojo Siwa, I actually think it's very important to talk about this concept of the personal brand in a little more detail, because it's a concept that actually everyone kind of has had and been encouraged to think of themselves in this way, even if you're not posting online and not trying your hand as an influencer or celebrity. In a journal article written by Susie Karmas, she wrote that self-branding has actually been around since the early 1920s, with books aimed at self-improvement and being the best version of you. These ideas were really to kind of generate productivity in the workplace. Ultimately, the idea started from a very capitalist place, and it was all about how to optimize yourself as if you were a product to be sold in a market. You were labor, and the market was jobs. Obviously, if you were constantly self-optimizing and trying to be a better version of yourself, I can't really imagine a single hirer or CEO who wouldn't want you. And of course, as a result of everyone starting to focus on themselves to get better jobs, CEOs and bosses got way more money in their pockets because you were more productive workers. Fast forward to now, many of us have grown up constantly told by parents and teachers that the jobs that you get and the people who are hiring you are interested, sure, in your experience, but are more interested in who you are and how you align with company values. I'm sure you've heard of that before. Oh my God, it's hell in there. Do you possess the qualities that the value and mission of our company is trying to reach? Do your personal attributes align with our company values? In Naomi Klein's book, doppelganger. She talks about this course that she convenes at a university, and the course is called The Corporate Self. Many of her students explain that they've been told on many occasions, particularly with their college admissions, to write about a time where they failed and what they learned from those challenges. This style of questioning is always very interesting, particularly in job interviews as well, because you have to think of yourself in a way where you don't want to reveal too much. Like, you don't want to say like, oh, I accidentally like sent out this email which meant that our shares dropped by 200%. Like, that's not what they're asking. Like, it's a very read in between the lines exercise. You have to find something that's like a small enough mistake that the company could go, that's bad, but not that bad, and then like come up with some really amazing remedy. And that's quite hard to package up. The point of this is that many of her students say that it felt like repackaging up trauma or commodifying your trauma to package up in a way that was sellable to your boss. You have to talk about these things in a way that's going to appease them and maybe even throw in some company values there. Oh, darling, you're getting the job tomorrow, girl. Naomi Klein goes on to say that this isn't just the types of questioning that you get in job interviews and in college admission essays, but it's the type of thinking that you have to then carry on for the rest of your career. You have to be able to give that 30-second elevator pitch because it does genuinely benefit you as a worker in the workplace. Now, to point out the obvious, having a job is kind of essential in modern day, unless you're a Nepo baby. I am so jealous if you are. Unfortunately, marketing yourself in this way is kind of like a non-negotiable, particularly if everyone else around you is doing this. If you're not doing this and everyone else around you is, it kind of starts to feel like FOMO. From this lens and from this perspective, if this ideology has been going on since the early 20th century, we've been almost socially conditioned to see ourselves in this branded way for almost a century. But the idea itself was kind of still on the periphery until the late 1990s, when Tom Peters wrote about the idea in an article called The Brand Called You for a magazine called Fast Company. He argues that grafting the logic of branding onto individuals is not only possible or desirable, it is imperative and inevitable. He simplifies this idea, and I have to give you a disclaimer and a warning. This next 30 seconds is going to be very cringe, and I do apologize. So he basically talks about this idea and he simplifies it by coining self-branding as, quote, the brand called Me Incorporated, and says, being CEO of Me Incorporated requires you to act selfishly, to grow yourself, to promote yourself, to get the market to reward yourself. I hate that so much. Now, it's important to note that the article wasn't a commentary on the phenomenon. It was basically an encouragement for everyone to start thinking of themselves in this way. And what I found really interesting about this is that it was actually really poorly received at the time. Many people at the time thought this whole idea was really dystopian. The idea that you would start perceiving yourself as a brand would surely lead to you hating all of your other colleagues, would surely lead to unhealthy levels of competition in the workplace, which would not be good for colleague morale. 30 years on, I think many people would agree that in many companies, this is the status quo. This is the norm. I genuinely think that many people would find it difficult to conceptualize a workplace that didn't have this kind of level of competition between employees and that was collegiate and friendly. And that's really sad and also maybe dramatic because I have worked in some very, very lovely places and they do exist. Only 30 years ago, this idea was really considered so individualistic. We would never see a world where anyone would view themselves legitimately as a brand. And yet I do think this is the way that a lot of people are getting jobs and promotions. The funny thing though about the personal brand is that at the time was that a lot of people couldn't really define exactly what it was. There were some people who were giving out some wild advice. I came across this article, basically argued that you may want to consider wearing a particular outfit or getting certain tattoos. Oh my God, can you imagine? Imagine going to a law interview and you've got the Magna Carta on your arm or the Constitution. Anyway, let's move on. Also, a lot of other articles like this one by Forbes was asking you to look introspectively. What is it about yourself that's unique? In an article by Sarah Burnside for The Guardian, she questions whether the personal brand is really any different to workplace reputation. And she further criticizes the concept by stating that, quote, if you were looking for a cartoonish foolishly simple example of what's wrong with modern society, the personal brand might just be it. People are encouraged to think of themselves in a deliberately dehumanizing way in order to succeed. I think it's actually really important to pause on this idea of the personal brand being dehumanizing, because it actually has a really dark history. To present yourself and identify yourself by certain qualities requires an exercise of reduction in your humanity. And it also requires, it's almost demoralizing in a sense, because it reduces you to certain factors about you, sometimes that you can't actually change. Looking further into the history of the idea, a piece that stood out to me and that Naomi Klein wrote about in Doppelganger was a book written by Simone Brown. It's entitled Dark Matters on the Surveillance of Blackness. And in it, she talks about the dehumanizing ways in which African people during the transatlantic slave trade in America were treated and essentially branded with violent mechanisms to literally print on their person a brand, an actual brand. This essentially branded these people as slaves, as someone who was owned for the rest of their lives. They had a literal physical mark on their body to identify them and their place in society. Quote, branding in the transatlantic slave trade was a measure of slavery's making, marking, and marketing of the black subject as commodity. In Naomi Klein's Doppelganger, she says that while branding and personal branding today obviously carries a very different meaning, you can't actually look at it holistically without looking at this very dark history and the dehumanizing origins that it does seem to have. Branding is inherently a way in which people are oppressed. It's important to look at the broader context in which these ideologies and Tom Peters' ideologies came, and that was in an era of the late 90s and early 2000s was a very strong era for neoliberalist policy and economics. This is the idea that basically let the market do its thing and governments should withdraw their spending on various welfare payments and systems that might benefit people in society. What this ends up doing is it creates this idea of neoliberal individualism. If governments aren't spending on kind of welfare, health, education, etc., it puts the onus on the individual for their quote-unquote success. This is where ideas like people and their poverty being a result of their lack of work or their laziness come in hand. It's the idea that your position in society is entirely your own responsibility and has nothing to do with the systems that bolster you up, the systems that disenfranchise you, the body you were born into, the family you were born into, the social dynamics you were born into, the intergenerational trauma you carry, the mental experience you have, the health you have, like all of these different factors that you have absolutely no control over. I could talk about this for days. I think this whole neoliberalist, individualist idea really creates the conditions that foster a dangerous level of lack of empathy between people and a dangerous lack of understanding about the ways in which our systems literally generate the conditions that we live in and the fact that we rarely actually have much control over our situation. And under this context, in relation to personal branding, if we're sold this idea that our access to certain resources and financial means is completely in our control, you can totally see why people would start to go, oh, well, I want to make sure that I get the good job, so I'm going to focus on my personal branding. It starts to make a lot of sense that people would hop onto this so much. But if we look at celebrities now, I think what's interesting is in this era, it wasn't just everyday people who are viewing themselves or starting to view themselves in this light. It was celebrities as well. Celebrities were really curating their brands in a very unique way in order to gain certain publicity, to align themselves with certain brands, to make money with certain people. The Kardashians are maybe one of the best examples of this, and I think what's interesting about them, they basically dehumanized and marketed themselves to become a multi-billion-dollar industry. The devil works hard, but Kris Jenner works harder. In her article on personal branding, Susie Karmas writes that successful personal branding, particularly among celebrities, requires, quote, at least a charade of consistently desirable aspirational attributes. except that, quote, consistency requires vigilance, authenticity, and the absence of unexpected hurdles that would require amendments or negotiation, all of which are extremely difficult for humans to ensure. Essentially, humans can be fantastic brands, but their unpredictability lends them to be very, very terrible brands at times, unless you're able to package up that terrible random event that's happened and somehow brand it to align with your overarching brand. And I think that the person who does that so incredibly well is Kris Jenner. Like, I do not know another person who's able to package up the faults of that family in a way that makes sense. They have got this art down to a T, and I think this is why they are so very successful. But someone who wasn't very successful at this, and I am sorry to say, was Tiger Woods. I feel like this is an example of an early 2000s brand gone wrong, particularly because he was kind of pioneered as like this, lovable family guy almost. And then he had an affairs, question mark, which literally was exposed to the world, and everyone and their mother knew about it. I was listening to a podcast by Jordan Teresa the other day, and she spoke about this event, and it made me cackle, because why is it that everyone has this collective memory of being like 7 years old and being like, oh my God, Tiger Woods had an affair? Like, I had no business knowing about this as a 9-year-old or however old I was. Like, I just feel like the waves of shock that cursed themselves through the ether was quite incredible and quite impressive, I will say. If we were kids at this time and we somehow heard about this, probably not even understanding what an affair was, I can only imagine what happened to his brand. And oh boy, looking at it now, it was bad. Within a few days, he lost sponsorships with multiple brands, including Accenture, AT&T, General Motors, Gillette, so many others. Harmless writes, quote, their message was clear. Woods no longer embodied the brand attributes that they hoped to secure through his endorsement, and falls in their market value confirmed there was subsequent material loss. So clearly, in the case of Tiger Woods, all publicity is not good publicity. And I think this is very interesting to talk about, because when we talk about modern day, I think that the idea of all publicity is good publicity is really being cashed in on, at least at the moment. It's not always going to work, but at the moment it seems to be working. And I think this is particularly interesting when looking at all the marketing research, and granted, I don't have any background in marketing. This is like research that I've undertaken personally. So it would be fascinating if you do have a marketing background, if you could please like leave some comments about your understanding of what's going on and different marketing phenomena and techniques, because from what I've read, it seems that for the most part, brands tend to value consistency and some degree of morality, at least when seeking to partner with people, particularly celebrities and influencers. They kind of want to know to an extent what they're getting themselves into, except with rage bait and inconsistency as kind of the key way of making shockwaves across the world when it comes to publicity right now. It feels like all of that has kind of gone out the wayside. So I want to talk about what is happening with Sydney Sweeney and Jojo Siwa and this whole idea of rage bait in marketing at the moment. Rage bait has been around for years, from clickbait YouTube thumbnails and titles to sometimes literally criminal acts being undertaken by people on YouTube. This idea of trying to provoke an emotional response from your audience definitely isn't new. Except the thing is that now it's almost become this like MO marketing trick, and it's seeped through to literally the ways in which politicians are acting with other politicians on the international scape. It's beyond me, really. Like, honestly, it makes it so much more troubling when people who rule the world are using rage bait as their mechanism for gaining publicity. It doesn't feel real. And I think that's actually one of the biggest problems today, is that nothing is feeling real. And rage bait contributes to this significantly. In an article written by Chloe Laws for Glamour UK, she writes that in the last week or so, Elon Musk tweeted that women were built to be traded to another tribe. Trump said he had never had the, quote, privilege to go to Jeffrey Epstein's island. Kim Kardashian's new face shapewear launched. And of course, Sydney Sweeney's advert with American Eagle looked, sounded, and felt like a eugenics dog whistle. In all of these cases, I personally think it's frankly naive to think that there wasn't some level of intentionality behind the response that was likely to be received. These are huge, either companies, politicians, individuals who know a thing or two about marketing. Like, there's a reason that we hear about these people all the time. They know exactly the response they're going to get, and they know exactly the strings to pull to gain public attention. But I want to focus specifically quickly on Sydney Sweeney's ad campaign, because this is a really interesting mechanism to gain public attention, and one that I don't think is harmless in the slightest. I have been debating whether or not to play this advert, and I just don't even know whether it's worth doing so, because it's kind of like even me talking about this, I've kind of ummed and ahed about, because I think that it does just do exactly what the ad is intended to do. And as I'll explain, the fact that we're even having discourse about this is exactly the point. Like, that is the point. The point isn't the dog whistle part. The point is the discourse about whether or not it is a dog whistle. Anyway, I think I'm not going to play it. I think I'm just going to read it out. But basically it says, genes are passed down from parents to offspring, often determining traits like hair, color, personality, and even eye color. Then she looks into the camera with her blue eyes and says, my genes are blue. Firstly and hilariously, when I was talking about this with my friends, one of them astutely pointed out that like the ad was kind of absurd from even the perspective that, why did she say that genes often determine like hair color, eye color? Like, don't they always? Isn't that always the case? Like, unless you're a robot, like what? That was funny to me. That did make me giggle. But obviously the outcry wasn't in relation to that. It was in relation to the fact that this really does seem like a dog whistle for white supremacy, particularly given she is a white woman with blonde hair, blue eyes. You know, it's giving. Now, many think that drawing this connection is, quote, ridiculous or chronically online. The reason why so many people are drawing these links was summarized really well by Dr. Anastasia Kaklina Gabrielle, who said, think a little bit about the ideological assumptions encoded in the media you consume and what's actually being sold here. It's not just denim, it's an ad campaign firmly rooted in the ideology of American whiteness. I think it's important to note that in the context of a country that is literally establishing regimes, schemes, and policies that are racist, sexist, homophobic, and pro-corporate, pro-billionaire, we are seeing the conditions that resonate, at least, or resemble putting an ad out that has at least a nod to that, has the slightest potential of being perceived in that light, is at least suspicious. The thing is, the fact that people aren't certain whether or not this ad is or isn't political, says something or doesn't say something at all, is exactly the point. This ad would not have had the same success, the same level of publicity and notoriety, if it was very obvious what the ad was saying. The fact that it's created debate and discussion and outrage is exactly what they were intending from this ad. Stocks for American Eagle were down in May, and in her article, Chloe Laws reports that since the ad, they've gone up by 18%. If we think about marketing in general and advertising, it often does reflect the political circumstances that are happening at the time. I do find it fascinating that so many people defiantly defend this ad as not being political, but like, first of all, everything's political. But second of all, like, of course it's going to reflect the policies and politics that is currently the dominant in a particular country. Also, not to mention that since the ad aired, Sydney Sweeney was revealed by The Guardian that she's a registered Republican voter, and people like JD Vance and Trump have literally decided to like retweet this ad. The result of this ad is very, very, very concerning, particularly when you've got someone who is so heavily in the public eye right now being adopted in by a very harmful regime. Anyway, the thing is, whether you like it or hate it, you've definitely heard about it. And all publicity in this case is good publicity when your stocks literally increase by 18% as a result. Brands like American Eagle in these circumstances are profiting off the inevitable discourse that they know it will generate because of the level of uncertainty in their campaign. Currently, there is a lot of, quote, like discourse happening in left-leaning spaces. Also, when you look at right-wing politics, a lot of right-wing politics is heavily underpinned by anti-intellectualism. When these two things clash, they clash quite significantly. When you've got people who have very strong opinions, really critically analysing things from a systems lens, and then you've got people on the other side who are pioneering anti-intellectualism, those two sides are never going to see eye to eye. All that does is generate anger that can't be critically discuss. Like, there's no room for debate when you've got one side just defiantly pushing back and both sides really defiantly pushing back from each other. Like, all that does is creates like a big explosion. This is when you have like, you know, people critically talking about this ad and then getting faced with people on the right who say, oh, you're just jealous. You're just jealous. Like, it's like, okay, well, what was the point of that then? Like, why did I actually even say that? Why do I even try?
I'm just jumping in here because I think it's really important to be super specific about what I'm talking about here. And I think one of the reasons that the left and right struggle to see eye to eye is that certain terms like fascism are ambiguous enough to seem to have very different meanings depending on who's actually saying the term. In a journal article by Lloyd Cox and Brendan O'Connor, the authors wrote that fascism is applied sometimes so broadly that distinct political systems are couched under the same term, except it can also be defined far too narrowly, leading to a misdiagnosis of what is actually happening in certain contexts. When it's defined too specifically, usually in relation to interwar European politics with reference to it only being possible under this kind of militarist rule, then a country that has such a heavy focus on neoliberal policies and capitalist individualism couldn't also be considered fascist. This, according to Cox and O'Connor, would be too narrow a definition. They define it instead as a mass political movement, party, or regime actuated by a radical nationalist ideology, preoccupied with national decline and rebirth, and obsessed with internal and external enemies who are presumed to be the source of national crisis and suffering. When referring to the United States in particular, and particularly under Donald Trump's first term, they say that, although it doesn't resemble the same qualities of interwar European fascism, quote, Trump's nostalgic white nationalism encoded in his MAGA campaign slogan, his authoritarian propensities and toxic masculinity, his rhetorical anti-elitism and anti-intellectualism, his vilifying of a variety of racialized internal and external enemies, his dehumanizing language and encouragement of violence, his avenging instincts and casual cruelty were all immediately recognizable to students of authoritarianism in general and fascism in particular. Trump has referred to undocumented immigrants on numerous occasions as not being, quote, people, yet then used the language of fascism to say in a rally speech on Veterans Day in 2023 by saying, quote, we will root out the communists, Marxist, fascists, the radical left thugs that live like vermin within the confines of our country. The real threat is from the radical left. To refer again to Klein, when speaking of these two sides of the political spectrum, she speaks of a certain mirror world. To quote Klein directly, how convenient it is for coalescing fascist forces if the term has been so abused that anti-fascists are loath to use it to accurately describe events in the real world. To try and throw some light in there, it's giving the Spider-Man meme, but everyone pointing to each other, accusing each other of being fascist. Companies are then profiting off of the chaos that ensues when none of us are using the same terms in the same way.
But obviously this isn't just the only type of rage bait that we see, and sometimes I actually think there's a type of rage bait that certain people engage in that perhaps demonstrates they've been so addicted to fame and notoriety or brought up to value this with such an intensity that it doesn't matter to them whether or not the publicity is good or bad. From an extremely young age on Dance Mums and then selling her hair bows so that other young girls could look like her, Jojo Siwa appears to have been basically raised with this idea that her identity is monetizable. Who she is on TV and online can be bought and sold for a lot of money. In fact, her hair bow business generated something like $400 million in sales. And let's face it, the only reason those kids were buying those bows was because they wanted to be like Jojo. So imagine from such a young age, basically thinking the world loves you, or at least a particular portrayal of you, a very commodifiable, monetizable version of you. Now, as an adult over the last few years, we've seen her shift and literally shapeshift over time into very different like eras. She could do her own eras tour, like, sorry, Taylor, move out the way. I'm sorry. I feel like, oh my God, I said Taylor Swift. Anyone who says anything about Taylor Swift is like cancelled from the internet. God. Anyway, sorry guys. I'm sorry, Swifties. I didn't mean anything bad by that comment. Anyway, while many of us watch on and she says that she's doing this new, never before seen rebrand that we've apparently never ever seen in our entire lives, and it's going to be new and radical and crazy, she is actually capturing a big audience as a result. And it does seem to be successful, even if people are hate watching. I'm not actually trying to spread hate here. I'm actually going to try and give an empathetic reading to Jojo Siwa in the best way that I can, but also I am really speculating, guys. Like, I have no idea. I do not know this woman.
I hate to say it. I hope I don't sound ridiculous. I don't know who this man is.
I think for any Aussies watching on, something that was really emotionally jarring over the last 12 months was when Jojo Siwa started dating Kath Ebbs. Kath Ebbs is an influencer who's kind of known for being really down to earth. Perhaps one of the few authentic influencers, or at least perceived to be authentic influencers. Jojo and Kath were dating. I was confused. And I think a lot of people started to think that maybe Jojo was putting it on. Maybe it was all an act. Except then Jojo went on Big Brother, had a complete rebrand, broke up with Kath. Now she's a trad wife, although actually most recently I had a look at her profile and she's doing this like song called Raspy, which is kind of like a satirical play on all the hate that she gets. It could be great, guys. I have no idea. Again, I'm not trying to promote hate, okay? I'm really not. I can imagine that if you were raised in an environment where you were told your whole life that your value as an individual and your identity is heavily tied to this personal brand and commodification of who you are, a sellable version of yourself, perhaps you would crave public attention regardless of whether it's good or bad. And because of this, most of us don't really understand her because we weren't raised in this environment. I can't even attempt to put myself in her shoes. But I can kind of understand this idea that when you're constantly praised for something in your childhood, you do cling on to that thing as something that heavily feels like part of your identity. However, I do think it's really important to note that this is obviously just my random hypothesis. And if you look at the other kids that were on Dance Mums, I couldn't say the same thing about them. Like, I don't think, at least my understanding, no one's got the same level of utilization of rage bait as Jojo Siwa does. There must be other factors at play then. Like, it can't just be the fact they were raised on a show like Dance Mums. But this is exactly the thing about personal brands. There is such a fine line between who you are innately as a person and who you are as a brand. And if you can't distinguish this, that becomes very challenging. But I think my overarching concern with this whole thing is as we start to view ourselves as brands rather than people, our value systems change because we start looking at ourselves as money makers rather than like empathetic members of society. And as more and more people end up viewing themselves in this dehumanizing way, we start to lose value for ethics and morality. And we start to see more and more companies engage in marketing that then profits off of our emotions, profits off of our concerns about the messaging that's being spread, and ultimately puts really concerning and oppressive ideas into the ether just because that will generate money for them. In this regard, personal branding and personal brands aren't harmless at all, but instead the ultimate indicator of a society that values corporate greed and profit making over humanity. So where to from here? Well, I think to start off with the bad and then get to the good, I think that we can't really, like, as long as our cultural value system is going to idolize consumerism, materialism, and and wealth, I genuinely don't know whether or not we can escape the personal brand. This does not mean that we're doomed. It just means that we need to critically assess the systems and value systems that we're in and the systems that we uphold. And I think it's important to note that just like everything in this attention economy that we're living in, we're going to get bored of this. I actually think it's going to end up a little bit like The Boy Who Cried Wolf, and we're going to see so many people, or at least someone like Jojo Siwa, whose now brand is to rebrand. It's not shocking if you're consistently shocking. I wonder for how long this will be kind of a mechanism to generate controversy and financial gain. I really have questions about how long this type of marketing style will actually work. And so I suppose we can hold on to hope that it won't for very long. But I think I want to leave you with this quote from Naomi Klein's book about clout, because I think that this is a great example of not influence, but clout for the sake of clout. And she says, "Clout is a calculus, not of what you do, but of how much bulk you-ness there is in the world. If influence sways, clout squats, taking up as much space for its own sake." As always, I am so interested in your thoughts on this one, and please do leave a comment if you have any experience in marketing. I would just be so fascinated to know what your thoughts are and what your perception of rage bait is. Interested in everyone's perspective, if you agree with this take, if you think that the personal brand is the neoliberal capitalist final boss, how you think we can kind of rid ourselves from this ideology. Please leave a comment, leave 5-star rating if you can, and I'll see you in my next video. Thank you so much for watching.